Merci d'être venu. Je suis Laurent Jean-Pierre, directeur du laboratoire Théorie du politique à l'université Paris 8 à Saint-Denis et co-directeur avec Christian Laval, qui est juste devant moi, de la collection L'Horizon des possibles aux éditions La Découverte. Nous sommes très honorés et très heureux d'accueillir ce soir les auteurs du prochain ouvrage que nous publions ces jours-ci dans notre collection. Ouvrage dont le titre pose une question à la fois difficile et que beaucoup se posent ici. Le capitalisme a-t-il un avenir? Je tiens à remercier très chaleureusement les 5 auteurs de cet ouvrage de s'être déplacés à Paris pour cette présentation publique. Pour la plupart d'entre vous, il est inutile de les présenter, d'autant qu'il faudrait quasiment disposer de la durée de notre session, et sans doute plus, pour rendre justice à l'ensemble de leurs publications et de leurs contributions cumulées aux sciences historiques et sociales. Je rappellerai simplement qu'Immanuel Wallerstien est historien, sociologue et économiste, chercheur émérite à l'université de Yale, que Randall Collins enseigne la sociologie à l'université de Pennsylvanie, que Michael Mann enseigne la même discipline à l'université de Californie à Los Angeles, Georgi Derlugian à la New York University d'Abu Dhabi et Craig Calhoun à la London School of Economics dont il est aussi le directeur. Chacun à leur manière, ils ont contribué depuis plusieurs décennies à ce qu'on peut appeler la macrosociologie historique, à un moment où la sociologie, dans de nombreuses traditions, n'osait plus bien souvent travailler à grande échelle, temporelle ou spatiale. Ils prendront la parole successivement, suivant l'ordre où je viens de les présenter, qui est aussi celui des chapitres du livre. Après leur présentation, qui durera en tout 35 à 45 minutes, nous aurons environ 3/4 d'heure au moins pour débattre. Les questions en français venant de la salle seront synthétisées en anglais si nécessaire. Quant aux réponses, elles seront en anglais ou en français. Je passe immédiatement la parole à Immanuel Wallerstien, que je remercie encore d'être parmi nous ce soir.
Bon, merci d'être venu. Ce livre est un peu exceptionnel de plusieurs manières. Il a été écrit par 5 personnes, tous s'appellent plus ou moins sociologues macro-historiques. Certains d'entre nous appellent cela l'analyse des systèmes mondes, mais en tout cas, c'est une analyse dans la longue durée. Ça, c'est l'essentiel. Et alors, nous pensons ensemble qu'on néglige la question qu'on pose ici, nous. Que la plupart des gens pensent que c'est absolument impossible que le capitalisme ne poursuit son chemin indéfiniment. Et on ne le discute pas sérieusement. Et on a voulu qu'on commence à le discuter sérieusement. Alors, voilà, nous pensons que nous accordons que nous sommes devant un grand tournant dont on ne peut pas s'attendre à ce qu'on sort facilement. Alors, bon, les détails de ce qui va se passer, ça c'est une différence entre nous. On a des analyses particulières différentes, certains plus optimistes, d'autres moins. En tout cas, en mettant l'accent sur ceci ou cela, vous entendrez les différents orateurs. Mais nous avons fait ce livre afin d'inspirer un vrai débat, pas seulement entre nous, mais mondialement, sur cette question, afin que les gens puissent en tirer des conclusions, chacun peut-être différent, mais des conclusions sérieuses sur ce qu'il faut faire actuellement pour répondre aux dilemmes qui sont devant nous. Alors moi, je vais commencer en vous parlant de mon propre livre. Alors, moi, je suis parmi les 5, celui qui est le plus fort pour annoncer la mort prochaine du capitalisme en tant que système. Ah, c'est pas nécessairement une chose optimiste, mais en tout cas, c'est une chose, à mon avis, inévitable. Alors, je fais mon analyse à partir de deux prémices. Hein. D'abord, le capitalisme, c'est un système historique, et comme tout système, hein, il n'est pas éternel. C'est impossible qu'un système persiste éternellement. Et deuxièmement, tout système, y inclut le capitalisme, existe à travers certaines règles qu'on pourrait analyser et qu'on pourrait tirer des conséquences. Alors pour moi, le capitalisme, la définition essentielle du capitalisme est qu'il permet la poursuite incessante de l'accumulation du capital. Et j'essaie de vous montrer pourquoi cette accumulation de capital est en train de cesser. Alors, l'opération normale pendant pour moi 500 ans du capitalisme tient plusieurs activités régulières. Il y a les cycles économiques, que moi j'appelle les cycles contractifs, mais peu importe le nom. Il y a les cycles géopolitiques, et ces deux cycles sont des cycles dans le sens qu'ils se répètent, mais ils se répètent d'une manière particulière qu'on pourrait appeler... bon, il n'y a pas un bon mot en français, mais en tout cas c'est un système où il y a deux pas en avant, c'est la montée, l'essor du cycle, et puis après un certain moment il y a une régression, mais jamais une régression de deux pas, mais de un pas. Donc à travers le temps, éventuellement, il y a une courbe qui monte, vers un asymptote, et il ne peut plus monter. Alors, quand il ne peut plus monter, c'est quand il arrive plus ou moins à 80% des possibilités, et il y a à ce moment-là, on est très loin de l'équilibre, et on arrive à une crise, ce que moi j'appelle une crise structurelle. Alors, j'ai pas beaucoup de temps maintenant pour vous expliquer pourquoi, comment ça a été inévitable, mais les trois coûts du capital, évidemment on accumule le capital en faisant un produit moins cher que le prix pour lequel on le vend, et il y a trois genres de coûts. Il y a les coûts du personnel, il y a les coûts des inputs, et il y a les coûts d'impôts. Et alors, bon, je constate que je n'ai pas le temps de vous montrer, mais c'est dans mon chapitre, pourquoi chacun de ces coûts augmente. On est arrivé à un moment où il ne peut plus augmenter facilement. Et alors à ce moment-là, il y a la fin de possibilité d'accumuler le capital. Un peu la financiarisation, dont on parle beaucoup ces jours-ci, mais qui c'est un ancien phénomène, n'est pas une accumulation du capital, c'est un transfert de capital d'un richard à un autre richard. Alors donc, le capitalisme arrive à un point où même les capitalistes ne le veulent plus, parce que c'est pas possible de faire davantage une accumulation du capital. À ce moment-là, on est dans ce qu'on pourrait appeler une crise où il y a deux moyens de sortir. Deux moyens de sortir, parce qu'il y a le branchement, c'est pas le mot, mais en tout cas, il y a deux possibilités de faire sortir. Un, c'est de repérer les pires aspects du capitalisme sans qu'il soit un système capitaliste. Et un autre, aller vers un système plus démocratique, relativement plus démocratique, relativement plus égalitaire. Alors c'est pas sûr, c'est impossible de savoir qui va gagner le jeu, et il est même plus compliqué parce que de chaque côté, il y a deux groupes différents, prenant des politiques différentes, dont 4 politiques en présence, ce qui est très compliqué, très incertain et très chancelant. Alors donc, je vous invite à lire le chapitre pour comprendre ce que je viens de dire.
Capitalism depends ultimately on having an income-earning population who can buy its products. Displacements of workers by machinery is the formula for the self-destruction of capitalism. In the 19th century, it was expected this would happen because mechanization would virtually eliminate the manual labor force. This did not happen because of the rise of a middle class of administrative and communicative labor. But now, computerization and the electronic media are eliminating the middle class. This is happening much faster than the mechanization of factory work. It took 150 years to eliminate most of the working class, while we are on a pace to eliminate most middle class work within 50 years from the takeoff of information technology in the 1990s. There are 5 main arguments why capitalism will survive. None of them is convincing. The first argument is Schumpeterian creative destruction. Destruction of jobs by new technology will always be balanced by the creation of new jobs. But this is only an empirical generalization from the period of mechanization. It has no theoretical causality, and it appears empirically wrong for the period of electronic elimination of labor. Moreover, the pace of eliminating middle-class work will increase in the future, since artificial intelligence mimicking the higher thinking of human beings is still in an early phase. Even the upper reaches of the capitalist class will be subject to replacement by computers. We can already glimpse the formation of a tiny class of computerized companies fighting to monopolize the production and distribution of virtually everything, such as the current struggles between Apple, Google, and Amazon. Escape number 2, globalization. Crisis may hit some parts of the world, but other regions will develop. Nevertheless, although the crisis of capitalism will be uneven, the mechanism is universal, and the entire world will ultimately be engulfed by it. Escape number 3. The growth of financial markets will provide income, or at least credit, for everyone, even as the drive for profits eliminates jobs. But financial markets are intrinsically unstable and will only add volatility to structural crisis as financialization grows bigger and more complex. Escape number 4, the Keynesian welfare state solution. This depends on political will and will no doubt be attempted again. But capitalist financial markets undermine such attempts to save capitalism via the state. We shall see how much Keynesianism will be possible as the structural crisis worsens. Escape number 5. a hidden Keynesian mechanism of expanding educational credentials, which undergo inflation, so that half a century from now, schools will be almost lifelong. They will resemble Chinese mandarins studying for the imperial examinations into their old age, but now including the entire population. Current struggles over the cost of mass higher education suggest the instability of this solution. My prediction coincides with Wallerstien's: the collapse of capitalism around the year 2045.
Alors que Wallerstien et Collins prédisent la fin du capitalisme, je dis que le capitalisme peut survivre. Contrairement à eux, je ne vois pas les marchés du capitalisme comme simplement géographiques. Les marchés sont par ailleurs illimités, parce que les entrepreneurs ont une capacité infinie à créer de nouveaux besoins. Qui de ma génération aurait pu envisager dans notre jeunesse le besoin d'avoir un laptop ou un iPhone, ou un marché de masse pour des tatouages, ou des vitamines, ou le génie biologique? Personne ne peut pas prédire quel nouveau besoin pourrait être créé, mais nous pouvons être absolument sûrs d'une chose: de nouveaux besoins, de nouvelles industries et de nouveaux emplois seront créés pour sauver le capitalisme. J'offre deux possibilités à propos du capitalisme de l'avenir. La première est plus pessimiste et moins probable. C'est le développement d'une société mondiale 2 tiers, 1 tiers, dans laquelle les 2 tiers de la population auront un emploi régulier, pendant que l'autre tiers sera au chômage et exclu de la société. Cependant, cela serait mieux que la situation actuelle, dans laquelle presque la moitié de l'humanité est exclue de la vraie participation dans la société. La deuxième possibilité est plus optimiste et plus probable si les classes populaires des pays du Sud se sont organisées pour réaliser un capitalisme réformé et relativement égalitaire, comme leurs homologues du Nord en fait. Cela permettrait une forme plus sociale du capitalisme. Il se pourrait que cela crée une classe exclue beaucoup plus petite, d'environ peut-être 10% de la population. À cause de l'absence des travailleurs surexploités dans le futur, ceci produirait une faible croissance économique. Mais cela serait semblable à l'économie du Royaume-Uni pendant les 18e et 19e siècles, lorsque ce dernier atteignait en moyenne seulement 1% de croissance annuelle. Mais sur une période de 100 ans, cela s'élevait à une croissance économique phénoménale. Cela pourrait se produire de nouveau. Mais ma contribution à ce livre n'est pas tout à fait optimiste. Je vois 2 scénarios futurs possibles qui pourraient gravement endommager ou même détruire le capitalisme et une grande partie de la société moderne en général. Il s'agit du changement climatique et de la guerre nucléaire. Ni l'un ni l'autre n'est intrinsèque au capitalisme. Le capitalisme n'est pas un système avec des lois cohérentes et internes. Il y a toujours des interactions entre le capitalisme et les autres sources de pouvoir social, idéologique, militaire et politique. Et ces interactions sont plutôt imprévisibles. Le changement climatique est une crise qui est très difficile à résoudre car il provient de toutes les trois institutions dominantes dans le monde. Le capitalisme engagé dans la poursuite illimitée de la bénéfice, les États-nations et les politiciens engagés dans la poursuite illimitée de la croissance du PIB, et les citoyens engagés à la poursuite illimitée de la consommation. Comme à propos de la guerre nucléaire ou guerre biologique ou chimique, le cauchemar serait un bombardier suicide portant une valise contenant une bombe. Le scénario optimiste est qu'il existe un accord international sur les changements climatiques et le contrôle des armes. Et cela renforcerait les tendances sociales du capitalisme, à produire sur une forme très réglementée du capitalisme. Un exemple peut-être du double mouvement de Calhoun entre les marchés libérés et le contrôle de la communauté. Merci.
Let me not mutilate the beautiful French language, and I don't think that, well, my Portuguese will be very useful here either. I have to start with confession that I never imagined that I would be, for the 97th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, in Paris. I first met Immanuel Wallerstien in Mozambique more than 20 years ago. I was a young officer in the Soviet forces fighting against South Africa at that time, and when Immanuel predicted to me that maybe, let's say safely, for the 100th anniversary in 2017, what made me feel so confident there would be a military parade on the Red Square, I thought he was crazy, honestly. My job in this book is more modest. I have nothing to say about the future of capitalism. I really don't know, like majority of us. But I can say about the past of communism something, and two of the authors in this volume, and it's exactly the same who are predicting collapse of capitalism now, that's Randall Collins and Immanuel Wallerstien, are on record having predicting the end of communism. What do we know now? So we have enough evidence, to judge their past predictions. I will not go at any length here. You have the book now. You can see, what they predicted. There were different predictions. Very much like today, they predict different things about capitalism, different mechanisms, I would say. But these were very important predictions because they were theorized. What we do in historical sociology, we have to test our hypothesis very much like engineers. To say that I wish humans could fly is poetry, and it was said many times in the past. And it could be beautiful, and people became famous and much appreciated for saying that. But to say I want humans to fly and to sit down at a desk and to figure out what would be the mechanism lifting the human body in the air and preferably also bringing it back safely on land is engineering. So this is basically what we do. We have to specify the mechanisms, how you get from here to there. If the system is going to collapse, you have to show why it collapses, where exactly it collapses and how. Regarding the past of communism, and we usually think about the Soviet Union, right? And we always say that it collapsed. So therefore we equate communism with collapse of Soviet Union. We're actually wrong, because look at People's Republic of China, which is the shining hope of capitalism today. It was not quite necessary for them to collapse because there were other possibilities. This is what we importantly stress in this book, that we cannot predict precisely because nobody can predict what exactly is going to happen, because it's open to our political intervention. We can intervene, we can change things. And by knowing what we are doing, we can change things. Major catastrophes of the last 200 years, beginning with the French Revolution. Of course, Michael Mann is the best, has some of the best explanation in his volume 2 of why it could happen. World War I, once again, Michael Mann has one of the best explanations in the last chapter of volume 2, the sources of social power, and collapse of the Soviet bloc, and that's me, in charge of these three catastrophes, French Revolution, World War I, and collapse of Soviet bloc became possible precisely because nobody could have imagined this possible until the moment it passed. More or less the same is quite possible with capitalism. And this is actually a very worrying situation because look at what happened once again to the Soviet bloc. The result was irrational for everyone, including its own elite of the nomenclatura. But there was a moment of tension when everybody thought that the system could be improved, but there was a political conflict about improving the system. It's very difficult today even to remember what people said about Gorbachev and Perestroika before 1989. It has to be, especially for the East Europeans themselves, it has to be excavated now. What were, say, in 1986, what were the hopes and what were the debates? And the debates were pretty much like about capitalism today. Okay, the thing is kind of rusty, but with some effort, with some goodwill, if only we had better leaders, more responsible, if they could share better. And the system eventually collapses precisely because there are too many projects and too many people at the top who realize that they're going to be replaced. So they run in panic, and they grab whatever they can grab, on the way out. This, of course, produces quite a few Russian billionaires, but this also produces a huge recoil to the third world of the country which once was on the threshold of becoming member of capitalist core. So this is a warning story, in part, that capitalism could collapse without anyone knowing it is collapsing. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to make many people happy. Very much like what happened to intellectuals in Eastern Europe. Because collapse of communism was a major victory of the new left. This is exactly what so many people wanted. The system of despotism was destroyed, and what did you get in its place? So this is mostly the kind of warning, besides of course testing Immanuel and Randall on their past predictions. This is what I was trying to do. And finally, a very small thing about China, so why China escaped? It's so easy. We all imagine that China must be very mysterious because it's so big and so ancient. Almost nobody, including myself, could imagine that China could have a very simple explanation, and it does. You just read the book.
Ok. D'après Georgi, le communisme n'a pas effondré. L'Union soviétique a fait. Le capitalisme ne cédera pas. Certains États capitalistes peuvent. Le capitalisme ne sera pas effondré, mais le capitalisme va changer et potentiellement au-delà de la reconnaissance. Dire cela n'est pas optimistique. Il portend l'avenir très difficile. 8.1. Nous ne sommes pas encore échappés à une dépression plus longue que celle des années 30. Cela a été aggravé par les politiques d'austérité, naturellement croissant et maintenant une préoccupation. Mais la croissance n'est pas une panacée. Il peut prendre différentes formes et de sa prestation peut être très inégalement répartie. 2. Le capitalisme, aujourd'hui, est dominé par la finance et cela augmente la précarité du capitalisme et presque rien n'a été fait au cours de ces 7 dernières années pour réduire le risque de crise systémique. En addition, le capitalisme financier augmente la mesure dans laquelle le rendement du capital est supérieur à la rémunération du travail. 3. Le capitalisme ne produit pas seulement la richesse, mais aussi des mauvaises choses, l'opposite de la richesse. On dit en anglais filth, compulsion. Ceci aussi inégalement réparti avec les moins bien nantis portant plus des coûts. 4. Les entreprises capitalistes dépendent de la capacité à externaliser une partie de leurs coûts. Les États portent la plupart des coûts externalisés du capitalisme, soit sous la forme d'investissement socialement organisé, comme l'éducation, ou la protection sociale, allocation de chômage, soins de santé. La crise capitaliste montre ainsi l'importance des États. Mais les États ne sont pas les seules institutions sociales pertinentes. Philanthropie et institutions mutualistes jouent également un rôle, qu'ils soient organisés dans les fondations ou dans les églises, et institutions commerciales, ce sont cruciales. 5. Globalement, nous sommes confrontés à un déficit massif dans les institutions sociales. Celles-ci ont été érodées dans les pays riches occidentaux, pas encore été construites dans plusieurs pays en voie de développement, et perdues dans la transition du communisme dans d'autres pays. Les sociétés commerciales qui autrefois offrent des avantages considérables aux employés ont été restructurées pour fournir moins à cause de pressions financières. 6. Dans le paramètre, les gens survivent à travers le recours à des réseaux informels et les institutions économiques alternatives, telles que les coopératives. Jusqu'à présent, si le secteur informel est important, il n'a pas démontré la capacité de travailler sur une grande échelle nécessaire pour relever le défi mondial. De même, les activités entrepreneuriales est vitale pour le dynamisme du capitalisme et beaucoup dépendra de la mesure de laquelle ceux-ci peuvent prospérer et évoluer eux-mêmes, en place non seulement être vendus aux grandes entreprises des investisseurs financiers. 7. Des plus grands risques pour le capitalisme sont largement externes, bien que l'entreprise capitaliste contribue à l'exacerbation de chaque type de risque. Je dis 3 premiers risques. Je me réfère à le risque de dommages environnementaux catastrophiques tels que le changement climatique. Okay. Le risque de conflit armé, y compris de déstabilisation guerre potentiellement généralisée. Et c'est le risque de la criminalité organisée à l'échelle mondiale. Ce n'est pas le secteur informel attractif. 8. Le capitalisme a longtemps grandi dans une collaboration institutionnelle avec les États démocratiques et libéraux. L'économie n'a jamais été aussi séparée de la politique comme idéologie à suggérer, mais dans l'avenir, l'autonomie relative de l'État et de l'économie peut être plus fortement effondrée. Il est possible que les États plus capables de fournir une protection sociale et de stabiliser le capitalisme sans devenir démocratique. Plutôt que la social-démocratie mondiale, nous pouvons voir le capitalisme d'État social. La démocratie est en question.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup. Oui, merci beaucoup d'avoir condensé vos chapitres qui sont très riches dans seulement 5 à 10 minutes d'intervention, ce qui nous laisse pas mal de temps pour un débat. Alors, ce que je vous demanderais, si vous avez des questions à poser, c'est qu'elles ne soient pas trop longues, parce que pour les questions de langue et de synthèse, on va passer par Luisa Ferrucci qui est à ma droite et qui fera une synthèse de vos questions. Donc je vous remercie de les condenser le plus possible. Voilà, merci beaucoup. Oui, allez-y.
Oui, donc, si vous me permettez...
Ah, pardon, je ne m'adressais pas à vous, je m'adressais à Dario, mais je garde en tête que vous êtes là. Oui, monsieur derrière. Oui.
Bonsoir. D'abord, je voulais saluer le...
Oui, si vous pouvez vous lever, c'est mieux, parce que finalement, ça donne une meilleure assise.
Alors, d'abord, je voulais saluer le style un peu prophétique de l'exposé, en tout cas de celui des deux premiers intervenants. C'est assez rafraîchissant. Pardon. Non, merci pour les prédictions sur la fin du capitalisme, c'est assez sympathique. On n'a plus trop l'habitude d'entendre ça aujourd'hui, à l'époque du refus du marxisme. Bon. Moi, ce que je voulais vous demander, quelque chose d'assez général, c'est est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que le caractère principal quand même du capitalisme, plus encore que la logique d'accumulation, c'est sa capacité à muter, à se réinventer, à poursuivre l'accumulation par d'autres moyens, via des transferts structurels dans les secteurs de l'économie par exemple, qui à mon avis, tendance qui est quand même bien réelle historiquement et qui risque de compromettre un peu les pronostics de fin du capitalisme, en tout cas qui risque d'alimenter la thèse selon laquelle le capitalisme a encore de longues heures, de longues décennies devant lui, voire de longs siècles. Voilà. C'est ce dont j'ai peur, hein. J'y trouve aucune complaisance, mais voilà.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your predictions on capitalism, and also he would like to ask you if capitalism has any...
Anybody, any of you?
If capitalism has any other means of accumulation that you...
Is capitalism what?
Does capitalism have any other means of accumulation?
They're going to survive by accumulating
survive.
by other means. This is one of the points you made.
Cela dépend de votre point de vue, hein. Pour moi, l'accumulation exige une production avec une survaleur. Alors à ce moment-là, ce que moi j'essaie de montrer, que il est devenu impossible de le faire aujourd'hui. On peut faire le transfert de capital déjà accumulé entre un Richard et un autre, un groupe ou un autre. On ne peut pas accumuler de nouveau. Pour moi, parce qu'il n'y a pas la possibilité de faire une production rentable. C'est l'essentiel de mon argument.
Peut-être que Michael Mann peut ajouter un point puisqu'il n'est pas d'accord avec ce point.
You've heard the limits of my French, so I will now speak in English. Well, this also raises not only what Immanuel said, but what Randall Collins has said already. And I think the question comes down to, can the process of what Schumpeter called creative destruction continue? That is the destruction of old industries, the creation of new ones. One might also say that we shouldn't be Western-centric about this. Western economies are not in a good state. Some countries don't have any growth, others have 2%, 3% maximum. But of course, many of the countries in the world are still experiencing very high levels of growth. People say well, China's in trouble because the 10% growth has gone down to 5.5%. Well, I think we would welcome that. So there's a kind of displacement possible. And the question is, what happens when the whole world is developed? And that, I think, leads to more than one possibility. There is the possibility of what Immanuel was saying, but there's also the possibility of what I think Craig, Calhoun and I are saying, of a kind of social democratic version of capitalism. But this is very unpredictable, and it depends on other disasters not occurring.
May I continue? Because
But Randall Collins wants to say something to you.
I think invoking Schumpeter is not very helpful to your cause, because Schumpeter writes a book in which he says that capitalism is doomed, and he bemoans it, but he has a whole long argument on the importance of mystification, on the importance of traditional authorities, and the fact that the capitalists have come along and bourgeoisified society is ruining the possibility of their own survival. So he didn't put a date on it, and he hoped it could be postponed. But he was on my side for different reasons, but he definitely didn't expect capitalism to survive forever.
Oui, Randall Collins voulait ajouter un mot.
The historical marker when capitalism appears, the really essential one, is the appearance of a labor market. That is labor moving on a market according to laws of supply and demand. We can add the consumerist version on here. The labor market has to be high enough so people can buy the products of capitalism. And it's precisely at that point that I see this enormous weakness. Michael Mann refers to Keynes writing a long time ago about the economic prospects of our grandchildren, who are probably us, or maybe Georgi. And arguing that there are limitless demands. But I think that's not really quite the point. You can have all sorts of demands. If you don't have the money to buy things with them, then it's useless. And that's kind of my critique about the internet. Yes, there are all sorts of things you can do on the internet, but if you can't make any money doing them, then the internet is actually just part of capitalism destroying itself.
Monsieur, levez-vous aussi, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Le micro derrière.
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais vous demander, les différents thèmes que vous avez abordés sur l'accumulation du capital, sur la croissance, sur l'inégalité et la disparition des classes moyennes, tous ces thèmes-là sont relativement familiers ici, à cause d'un livre qui est celui de Piketty, là, sur le capital au XXIe siècle, qui essaie, lui, de résumer un peu tous ces éléments en une espèce de théorème, même si vous n'en êtes pas d'accord, et je ne suis pas d'accord avec son théorème, mais peu importe. En tout cas, il reprend tous ces éléments en un théorème qui serait que, au fond, on peut caractériser la période actuelle à nouveau comme une situation dans laquelle la rémunération du capital est supérieure à la croissance, et ce qui, inévitablement pour lui, se traduit par un creusement des inégalités. Dans la mesure où c'est devenu ici un thème familier, je voulais avoir votre point de vue, si c'est possible. Et si je me suis permis de citer Piketty, c'est qu'il a été rendu célèbre aux États-Unis avant d'être lu ici.
I think you understood the question. It's your reaction to Piketty's argument.
I have to claim Piketty's argument. He's an LSE PhD. I generally in agreement with Piketty, but I think it's only part of the story, and that the concept of capitalism is a bit limited to the returns on capital in Piketty's account, and that's not really quite a concept of capitalism in the sense we're talking about it. I think that, as I stated in my bad French, the argument about the returns to capital exceeding the returns to labor most of the time is sound. I emphasized it's particularly true with the growth of finance, and that one of the features of the last 35 years is an inversion of the proportion of wealth held in the form of financial assets and held in the form of material assets. 35 years ago, 25% financial assets, now 75% financial assets. This facilitates radical inequality as well as the mobility of capital globally. It doesn't seem to me that Piketty's argument says anything about the end of capitalism, only about the unattractiveness of capitalism. And the question is, capitalism going to simply become more unattractive, or is it going to be changed, or is it going to collapse, is I think the question before us. And I have suggested, I think, first, collapse is not guaranteed as much as some of my colleagues think, so we ought to also ask about change. Second, I think here Michael Mann and I are in agreement, and we have been labeled optimistic, but it's a very peculiar kind of optimism. We have said we think ecological crisis and war may be likely to come sooner than any collapse of capitalism. That's not exactly optimism, except that capitalism might survive long enough for climate change to kill us first, or nuclear holocaust to kill us first. That's part of our prediction. But further, that if that doesn't happen, then the question is, can capitalism resume accumulation and resume some kind of flourishing? That doesn't mean becoming attractive. And in different ways, Michael Mann and I have each said, yes, there can be potentially new forms of communication, of accumulation, no guarantee. And he has stressed a somewhat more optimistic hope for social democracy on a global scale. I have stressed a less optimistic expectation that the success of capitalism might sever its historical connection to democracy and lead to state capitalisms with much less historic freedom, but solutions to social problems.
A comment here about how we're using the term optimism and pessimism. So use it from a sort of a capitalist point of view or a status quo point of view. The end of capitalism is pessimistic. I suggest that it's optimistic. And I've got to steal an argument from Mick here about, he's got a terrific analysis I think in the fourth volume of his big book about the causes of the environmental crisis. He says it's the intersection of the three strongest forces of our time: capitalism, national autonomy, and consumerism. Okay, so from that point of view, if Immanuel and I are right, and I'm kind of basing it on the things that he and Giovanni Arrighi have said over the years about how long hegemonic cycles take, so that's why I picked that year around 2045. The full brunt of the environmental crisis is about 50 years later to that. We will be lucky if we get out of capitalism, because getting out of capitalism will get us out of the environmental crisis. Otherwise, no, we are never going to get out of the environmental crisis under capitalism.
Well, we may. I agree that the likelihood of nuclear war, of climate disaster, etc., is A, there, and B, is not as immediate, I agree, as the crisis of capitalism. But if we get out of capitalism, it depends on which of the two ways we get out of it.
Exactly.
Because one way, for me, what capitalism, the way in which capitalism is different from previous systems that existed in the history of the world, right, is that they added to exploitation and hierarchy the element of polarization, right? Now, you could create a non-capitalist system, perfectly possible analytically, create a non-capitalist system that would be hierarchical, exploitative, and polarizing without it being capitalist. There are many possibilities of doing that, and that is one of the possible outcomes of the crisis that we're in. The other possible outcome is, in fact, what my two colleagues who are optimistic, pessimistic, but think it can be solved, actually might solve it. I mean, we might end up in a more relatively egalitarian, relatively democratic world, which we have never had. And social democracy in practice has not been that, but that's another argument we can have. But that's only a possibility. If that possibility were to come true, then indeed, as Randy just said, then indeed I would be optimistic that we could handle the climate change problem, and we could handle the nuclear war problem, and the third, which you didn't mention, which is equally possible, are the pandemics. Another major possibility lying over our head like a sword of Damocles. But only if we come out of the crisis in with sort of my side winning rather than the other guy's side winning. And I insist on its being unpredictable, but also being something which we can affect. That comes into the business of the butterfly, the little butterfly that a little flick of your hand, a little flick of the butterfly's wings at one end of the world affects the climate at the other end of the world. And I always end my own speeches with, we are all little butterflies, and it depends on how much flipping we do all the time, in every possible way, in every possible realm. So I offer activism as a real possibility of being something that will help in this situation.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question, d'autres questions? Oui, madame.
Oui, bonjour. Alors, par rapport à...
Vous avez de la voix, mais le micro est nécessaire néanmoins.
Non, c'est pas nécessaire. Pour la vision non optimiste, alors, d'après ce que j'ai compris, la disparition, l'effondrement du capitalisme serait peut-être dû à des catastrophes climatiques, du gangstérisme ou un cataclysme nucléaire, des pandémies peut-être, mais il y a une hypothèse qui est l'élément subjectif que je n'ai pas entendu dans les petites interventions, c'est la lutte des classes. Est-ce que cette hypothèse est encore valable en sachant que vous êtes tous plus ou moins marxisants? Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Merci.
Moi, je suis marxisant dans ce sens-là. Alors, la lutte des classes est centrale, à mon avis. Ah oui? Mais la lutte des classes, c'est quelque chose de compliqué à analyser. Et je trouve pas mal, la grande majorité des analyses de lutte des classes sont trop simplistes. Mais moi, je trouve que le capitalisme inclut une lutte de classe continuelle. Bon, ça, c'est quant à moi. Je ne parle pas pour les autres.
Moi, I am not Marxist, but I agree with you that class struggle has been central to the development of capitalism. It's not the only thing that inhabits the world. There are other forms of stratification, and there are relations between states which have fundamentally brought major wars and could well do so in the future, which cannot be reduced to class struggle. As far as the dating is concerned, I don't see why my colleagues think that the crisis of capitalism will come before the other crises. I think that on the part of capitalism, it has quite a long way to go before it penetrates the entire world. And I simply don't see the 30, 40 or 45-year termination of capitalism. As far as nuclear war, that could obviously happen any time, and nobody can predict. As far as the environmental crisis is concerned, I'm not thinking so much of the final crisis, but of the greater and greater visibility of the changes that are occurring, which I think will become evident before there's any major crisis of capitalism. But that crisis will involve, a massive amount of investment going in alternative energy sources, and it would not produce a kind of a united capitalist pursuit of profit damaging the world. I mean, we can already see that wonderful organization, Walmart, produces almost no emissions because it's only its trucks. And if things get a bit dangerous, and if the visibility of the climate change is occurring, which it will in 20 years, then we'll see great splits among capitalists, and in general, the pursuit of profit will not be simply counterproductive for the environment.
I want to come back in on this as well. There's no point in being a Marxist in the sense of being a loyalist to any particular set of ideas. They're only worthwhile if they correspond with the mechanisms that we think are true. I've made an argument here about why I think, given the rise of information technology and the computerization of the middle class, that Marx's prediction is back on the table. It has actually quite an optimistic end to it, and I think they're full of reasons why we could adopt this optimistic position. So remember, the projection is that more and more workers get displaced into this reserve army, which no longer has anything to do, and you get a tiny number of capitalists. Eventually, you end up with one big monopoly. At that point, there's no class struggle. You've got a tiny number of capitalists. You've got everybody else, and you could just as easily vote yourself into a socialist solution. See, so it depends on the mechanism being correct. But
that's what those social democrats always thought. Vote yourself in.
Well, they think that you could vote yourself in before you get the crisis. You don't need a crisis. Well, we're going to get the crisis whether we like it or not. And from that point of view, now it may be there's a period in there as things start going downhill. We might, very well get these, sort of fascist capitalist type of movements. Like, we really want to hold on. We're going downhill. There are not enough of us anymore. We want to hold on to it. But the forces of capitalism, you can see it right now. I mean, actually, when I started writing this thing 4 or 5 years ago, Apple wasn't as big a company as it is now, and they're not trying to take over the credit card market. And it's got to the point where these a relatively small number of companies basing themselves on the most advanced computer technology are pushing to the point where I'm not sure it's going to take that long before you get, I don't know, four or five people. I keep seeing this goes to Steve Jobs there, who started out being a radical, but he created this company that, is as voraciously capitalist as you could possibly get, and they're fighting it out. Just because you got these guys who wear T-shirts to work doesn't mean they're not capitalists. This system operates in exactly that fashion, and it's jumping there. I mean, that's the kind of things that you're on the market there. I'm astounded by it every 2 years that they're. At first I thought, Apple, it's really cool. You got all this stuff that you can use, and and then you discover that and they. Amazon wants to control the entire book publishing market. I mean, they want to set the prices on all the books, and kind of, in effect, they want to destroy all publishing companies. So you can see that's called the drive towards monopoly capitalism, and we're not that far away from it.
But this happens in all industries, and has happened in all industries. A tendency towards oligopoly, monopoly. New industries start out highly decentralized.
Correct. Indeed, I agree that it's recurrent. I still think the Western bias is worrying again. So there is a lot happening in the West to be worried about, and even the image of fascist capitalism. But I'm not sure that the non-West simply repeats a Western story in this. Even if there is capitalism in some sense in China, the institutional structures are pretty different. And I think that there are complex potential stories in China, in India, in various places in the world. So the outcome of struggles over the fate of capitalism in Europe or the US don't necessarily tell us the fate of capitalism globally, which can be a restructuring in a very powerful way in Asia or in other parts of the world that changes the West in profound ways. On the class struggle, I wanted to intervene in saying that I, like some of the rest of us, think the Marxist analysis of capitalism is on the table, and we have various ideas about whether that's back on the table. That was always right. I tend to think it was always critically right. The idea that class struggle derived simply and directly from the analysis of capitalism, and that it would be the decisive mode of struggle, I think is a more dubious part of the Marxist argument. Michael Mann and I have both referenced Polanyi's idea of double movement, the idea of capitalist destruction followed by rebuilding of social protection. I would stress more than Polanyi did that it took struggle. This didn't happen automatically. It was because people fought in trade unions and in political parties and in other ways to get that social protection. So struggles are very, very important to whether you get more progressive or more terrible solutions to stabilizing capitalism. But the struggles are not only class struggles. The struggles are organized in a variety of different ways. Some of the struggles in the world today that are giving the most friction and resistance to capitalism are nationalist struggles, are religious struggles, are organized in other ways. Historically, in the West as well, it wasn't always and only class struggle that was the basis. It was the struggle of local communities who refused to be incorporated from different regions into the nationally centralized. It was a struggle of colonial peoples against colonial power. So what I would say is struggle absolutely, but raise the question of on what basis the struggle is organized in all of this. And one other footnote while I'm speaking, it goes back to Piketty as well. Something that Piketty does not consider very much is what is done with wealth. His main interest is in the continued return to wealth, to capital as invested wealth. But the questions of what's done with it, whether it is consumed in luxury goods, whether it is turned into philanthropy to fight for one another cause or not, or whether it is simply reinvested in more accumulation are crucial. And one of the great changes in capitalism from Marx's day was the development of corporations potentially able to engage in infinite accumulation, different from individuals who die and lose some of their continued ability to accumulate or have their stupid sons inherit or something like that. But it's also the case that state capitalism has some of the same advantages of massive capacity for continuous accumulation, and that we should look at not just whether wealth capital is winning out against labor, but how wealth is being organized, in what kinds of institutional structures with what kind of power.
Monsieur.
Merci. Si j'ai bien compris ce qui vient d'être dit à l'instant, je crois qu'effectivement le problème est sur la répartition des richesses, c'est-à-dire que produire plus, toujours plus efficacement, toujours plus de productivité, je crois assez que le dynamisme du capitalisme réussira à le faire. Mais comment il va le faire? En accumulant du capital, d'un côté, qui va être concentré dans la main de quelques-uns, en concentrant aussi du capital humain dans la main de quelques-uns qui seront nécessaires pour faire tourner ce capital, et finalement une grande majorité qui n'auront ni le capital financier, physique, matériel, ni le capital humain. Et cette masse, cette armée de réserve va être de plus en plus grande. Et donc, comment répartir la richesse à partir de ce moment-là? Sachant que l'acceptation à payer de ceux qui possèdent le capital humain, financier ou matériel, elle va diminuer parce qu'ils pensent qu'ils sont les gagnants du système, qu'ils méritent ces gains. Et les autres, en fait, sont les exclus du système sans possibilité de revenir dedans. Parce qu'ils n'ont pas accès, par exemple, à l'éducation, qui devrait être financée par une redistribution. Donc comment faire? Si on reprend par exemple les travaux de l'école de la régulation, le capitalisme a vécu des moments où il y a eu des compromis entre les différentes classes, une redistribution des gains de productivité. Mais finalement, le compromis était possible parce que on avait besoin de salariés, y compris de salariés non qualifiés. Et aujourd'hui, le compromis va être impossible avec une majorité de gens au fur et à mesure que le temps avance. Donc finalement, ma question c'est, le vrai problème, c'est pas tellement l'accumulation des richesses, mais c'est comment on les distribue, sur quelle base, sur quel accord social. Et là, je crois qu'il y a un problème. Et je crois que c'est aussi ce que disait M. Collins sur le marché du travail, si j'ai bien compris, mais mon anglais n'est pas terrible.
So his main question refers to how to distribute wealth among society.
And it's also about the fact he takes up on Randall Collins' argument saying that the reserve army of capitalism will grow, and so the problem of redistribution of wealth is much more complicated, and there cannot be any compromise as there used to be within capitalism, where the reserve army, when the reserve army was not as big as it's going to be.
I take this as a point of agreement.
Yeah.
With you. Yeah.
With you.
Well,
You press the button.
I take it as a point of agreement, and I know, we have these are the social democrats over. So being a social democrat is not an impossible position, but historically the social democrats came from various times, took over capitalist regimes, and then when you take over the regime, you become responsible for it. They didn't come in when there was a crisis, when the thing was, had collapsed. So it's like being the junior partner in the government. We have that the Liberal Dems in England really destroyed themselves by coming into government as a junior partner. Right? It's that kind of problem.
But the main alternatives, socialism in the full sense and fascism, have been completely discredited. And what has not been discredited are social democratic groups, or as Craig Calhoun says, forms of state capitalism. And so there are alternative ways, and it seems to me that socialism in any full sense, and still less fascism, are simply not attractive to many people in developing countries. And they're much more likely to go through labor unions and through demands for democracy and the like, and end up with the kind of compromise regime that we have. And though times may be bad here and inequality is widening, it's not back to 19th century levels. Social democracy has achieved an enormous amount in the Western countries.
No, I wouldn't say that social democratic position is, how shall I say, acclaimed by very many people. How else do you account for this incredible loss of authority and of faith in the United States for Obama, in France for Hollande, and we could go around continually like that, simply a widespread deception about the, how shall I say, what you get out of social democracy. I think the discrediting of classical communism it pales before the discrediting of social democracy historically. And I think that's a very widespread sentiment around the world today. Even in India, you could account. I mean, basically, the Congress Party was a mildly social democratic party, and you've got Modi now. I mean, instead, who, if anything, is not a social democrat. I mean, so I'm not sure that you can claim that it's been reflecting 100 years of its history, let's say starting with Bernstein, that it's been a movement that has succeeded in attracting large masses of population across the world.
Well, you don't have it so bad in France.
Well, maybe not.
You have what is virtually a national health service. You have all workers, well, not all, but the vast majority of workers receiving decent wages so that we don't have to tip in restaurants and the like. There are the charges which every employer has to pay. You're pretty coddled by, it's not merely social democracy, it's the statist element in France too, but some combination of it has produced a high level of civilization.
Indeed. So what happens to Europe is one question, and the European social democratic model, is this a future of stagnation and gradual decline, but better than some sort of collapse, better than many things that could happen, and in need of some fighting to protect some of its attractive qualities, but also what happens elsewhere. And here, I have to say, I don't think Georgi's a social democrat. I just want you to know. His problem is only that the communist country he grew up in disappeared. The Congress Party in India is a good example of this. It was a massively corrupt social democratic party whose organizational failings and corruption brought it down, not being social democratic per se.
You know a non-massively corrupt country?
The party, right? And I think, there are variables, and I think that's actually a key point, that very few things are simple either-or propositions. There are variations in the extent of corruption, in the extent of organized criminal activity, in the extent to which welfare states perform well or poorly, in which the ambition to change them can grow. So I would actually claim to be a socialist, but I would want to insist on democratic socialism and not necessarily a revolutionary path of transition. But we can play with these labels a lot and miss some things. So let me take the offered language of regulation theory, which I find very sympathetic for thinking about this, and the idea of what is the realistic compromise, if you want to use that language, among contending forces, and at what point does one arrive at a stabilization, not an ideal solution, not necessarily an optimum, but a stabilization, whether it's a Fordist stabilization or whatever other historical period stabilization. And I think the key question here isn't local here. It is much more global, and it has a lot to do with other parts of the world. It has to do with things like, which problems will people in developing countries want solved first, or what will they settle for in terms of compromises in the midst of struggle? So for many, solving problems of security, of personal security, will be very basic, and there will be a great deal of temptation for a successful state regime that can deliver personal security to get a lot of support. Solving issues of the spread of pandemics, issues of hunger, a variety of issues become very important, and so what we have to ask is, in what coalition or compromise of powers do these issues get solved enough to head off very strong struggles? Secondly, most of the struggles aren't anti-capitalist. They are organized in political terms around states and bandit regimes and various other kinds of structures. Capitalism per se isn't the object of very many of the most powerful struggles that are going on in the world. and that threaten this. So that we need, I think, regulation. There's actually a nice framework for thinking about parts of the question, but we shouldn't just apply it to ourselves. We should ask what kind of stabilizations that are not necessarily solutions will be arrived at in other settings of the world. And as somebody who spends a lot of time in China and has for a long time, I'd say, it's not obvious to me that liberal democratic capitalism is the path of the future, but it's not obvious to me that you should not describe China as capitalist, and then ask what kind of social formation is going to organize and carry out and maintain political power in China. And it could collapse, but I wouldn't say that I would bet a lot of money that the Chinese state is going to prove one of the weakest states in the world anytime soon.
Allow me, since we are almost nearing the time limit, just wanted you to observe, as I always quote Randall Collins on this, that unlike chemists, sociologists cannot stop being sociologists. If a chemist thinks about what is the chemical composition of this table, might go crazy, we always have to pay attention reflexively to what we are doing. Notice, there are no conservatives at this table. In many countries, this would be taken as something scandalous. I think it just illustrates what's happening in macrohistorical sociology. That once you start thinking seriously about how the system functions, it's very difficult to come up with conservative position. Of course, there are people who are out there seriously, like Francis Fukuyama, preaching for a better capitalism, and they are worried. There are very few people, but there are eminent people like George Soros, who are also talking about it. Otherwise, Thomas Piketty was already mentioned here, and that brings me back to my youth years, when in the Soviet Union, in the beginning of Glasnost, there were revelations like, but a very important work, to prove that we do have inequality in a communist country, that our nomenclatura have special privileges, or that we do have prostitution. So this is a huge revelation, not leading so far to much of analysis. However, once you start analyzing, so what? It's capitalism, right? But it is a very important revelation, precisely because it undermines the self-legitimation of the system. The system was supposed to become more and more, you call it social democratic, or everybody becomes middle class eventually. And now you read and you feel that all around you that, no, we're not becoming all middle class. Not probably all around the world. The troubling question really is that, of course, we are here, when we think very in sophisticated terms about it, and we try to write in simple English and French and Russian and Chinese about our analysis, we all end up being somewhere between social democrats and socialists. However, once you step outside, you would see, that say, who are the real political heroes of Eastern Europe? They're General Pinochet now, and Putin, and Orban in Hungary, and it's getting more and more to the right. We don't want to speak much about possibility of a fascist political economy, but we have to. Thank you.
Oui, je vous ai vu. Alors alors je vais prendre plusieurs questions là parce qu'on se rapproche effectivement d'un moment. Donc je vais prendre votre question, une là et une là-bas, 3 questions et on verra après. Des questions courtes s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, I'll say in English. I address my question to Mr. Derlugian. The debate was very passionate. It reminded me of debate between Einstein and Niels Bohr. One was saying that the world is, there is one law we can describe the whole world, and another was saying that, yeah, everybody that. So my question is, I understand that Albert Einstein was Marxist, but does Niels Bohr was Schumpeterian or not? Georgi, please.
He was rich. He was more like Michael Mann. Well, he doubted, that there could be one. If you allow me, just because it's probably to lighten up the situation is now my job. I always thought that Immanuel Wallerstien has a macroscopic or telescopic view of the world. Randall Collins, of course, has a wonderfully microscopic view, if you read especially his book on violence and many other interaction ritual chains. And Michael Mann has a kaleidoscopic view of the world. Things come together in many different configurations. You can see that I teach too many undergraduate students, probably. I have to explain too many things. We are undecided, but as you can see, we're critically undecided. I don't think that we can ever reach a consensus there. So my job is mostly, to explain that whatever we are saying, once you start thinking seriously about this kind of system, well, it is a system. By the way, writing the conclusion to the book was a horrible work. Just avoiding the word system because one of the authors insists that there is no system. That it doesn't work, and using all kinds of euphemisms there. Nevertheless, once you start thinking seriously about it, you end up being very, very afraid, and you should be.
J'ai vu deux questions au moins, monsieur, et il y en a une par là-bas. Voilà. On les prend les deux. Allez-y, levez-vous.
Bon, bonsoir, je suis désolé, je ne pense pas pouvoir poser la question en anglais. Je la ferai en français. Ma question va peut-être paraître... Comment le capitalisme s'adapterait-il si on changeait la nature du droit de propriété ? Actuellement, le droit de propriété est absolu. Si le droit de propriété devenait un droit d'usage, que se passerait-il ? Merci.
I'll ask in English too. So my question is simple, yet I think might be complicated to answer. So since we actually are the Latin American house, I was wondering what do you guys think about the Latin American situation right now, as this there has been a left government there in most of the countries for the past 10 years almost now, so it's kind to, we could maybe say that it could be a situation that it has a long term to it, and it might change something, I guess, maybe in the long term as well. So I was just wondering, what do you think that it could do to the international system in terms of the collapse or not of capitalism?
The first question was about property rights. What if property rights were not absolute anymore and were changing to use rights or use rights?
Well, there's no real simple answer to what a socialist system should be like, but I think at a minimum it would really have to take over the financial sector. In other words, in effect, nationalize the banks. If you did that, so in effect, you're socializing capital. There'd be no reason why people couldn't have private property of various sorts, or even local markets. I think sort of the snake in the Garden of Eden really is finance capitalism.
Yeah. Here, one just has to remember the argument of Randall, that the genuine capitalist, the one who is on top and successful, is someone who doesn't care whether he's making his money in finance or production or indeed in exchange. He moves between them. He's a non-specialist. He goes wherever the likely largest income is, and I think that explains a good deal of how the capitalist system actually works, and has always worked.
About Latin America, do you have anything to say?
Well, on the question of inequality, Latin America has historically the highest levels of inequality of any part of the world that provides reasonable statistics. Unfortunately for equality, they've never had a world war. They've never been involved in a world war, which has been the single factor producing bursts of equalization, towards equalization. And that is an indication of how difficult it is under normal times to reduce levels of inequality. But of course, this is happening a little bit in Latin America right now, and this is an example of the move towards a more real democracy, and perhaps in some senses a social democracy. I mean, there are troubles all along the way, but I think it's an improvement.
Yeah, quick on Latin America. I think there are different stories. There's not a single story. The Bolivarian revolutions are a different story from what's happening in Chile and so forth. And some of them are running out of steam, some are not so much. The situation is a lot better in Bolivia than it is in Venezuela at the moment and so forth. I think in looking at that, I think is that there are several different experiments going on in trying to reduce inequality and change the organization of inequality in different countries, change what it correlates with. And of course there's resistance to this going around. But there's a lot, part of this is actually trying to create room for small businesses, so as distinct from large corporations. So even within that idea, is there a better capitalism, a worse capitalism? Latin America is a fairly interesting and dynamic setting for that. But I would say that the trying not to have capitalism collapse is as prominent in many countries as trying to build a kind of Bolivarian socialist alternative in others. And if you look at the struggle in a place like Venezuela and the rather substantial shifting of sides away from the pro-government to others, you see some of the problem that's going on in all of this. I'll take this back to Niels Bohr in closing and say, no single global theory and probably no single global compromise, stabilization, different historically dependent solutions in different places.
Je suggère qu'on prenne...
Je peux dire un dernier mot.
Oui, peut-être qu'on va prendre une ou deux questions.
Nos arguments réels dans ce livre sont très denses. Il ne faut pas prendre ce que nous avons dit ici comme le texte. Parce que chacun de nous a fait une argumentation beaucoup plus étoffée et beaucoup plus cohérente que nous avons pu vous montrer ici. Ce que vous avez vu ici, c'est le fait que nous ne sommes pas tout à fait d'accord.